and welcome to Takeover TV's Footy Wrap. I'm your host of sorts, Mark Fine, and I'm joined this evening by Troy Zantuck. How are you, Troy? You're going to join me with the hosting duties tonight?
Great to be on board, Finey, and luckily enough, we're going to be joined by two absolute superstars of the game.
I reckon they locked horns as well somewhere along the bat. Somewhere down the track, they must have run into each other because we've got one of the definitive greatest finals player of all time. But beyond that, brilliant defender, a great football person. Having his first year off, I think we worked it out last week, in 40-odd years, just having a year off from footy. It took the COVID to knock him away from football because he's coaching the mighty Borough. G'day to Gary Ayres. How are you, Ayresy?
Yeah, great, Finey. Thanks for that introduction, and good to see Santa's on, and good to see Rene back again for another week. So, yeah, all good, mate. Appreciate it.
Well, the mighty Rene you speak of is the only Rene to have graced our football fields at the highest level. I'm pretty sure. I can't think of another Rene, but I can certainly say that this one is all ours on Takeover TV's Footy Wrap. The great Rene Kink. How are you, Rene?
Good, thank you, Mark, and terrific to be on board with you guys and looking forward to the football happenings at the moment. It's very interesting, and going forward, it's going to be a great finish to the year.
Now, I've got to ask all three of you. I'll start with you, Rene, given that you're on air at the moment. Football every night. Have you watched every game? Are you indulging in football every night? Has it caused a rift between you and the good lady? Because in my house, I haven't spoken to the rest of the family for, 12 days now?
Yeah, look, it's been tough with my floor manager. I'm thinking about sacking her because she brought a little bit of eggs when I want to watch the football. And of course, she wants to watch Farmer Needs a Wife. So it's a pretty tough gig from my point of view, but I'm doing my best. Look, at times, if you get a great game like we have seen, fantastic. But when you get a crap game, it's a bit disappointing. So we just got to keep marching forward and look forward to good games happening.
Yeah, good call. How about you, Xanas? Have you indulged in all 12 nights, or what are we up to?
I've got to say, I had to take a couple off. I was all over the St Kilda Geelong game. I followed with much interest the Brisbane Lions and the Bulldogs game earlier this week. Really disappointed with the Dogs, but the Brisbane Lions, they look like the real McCoy, and obviously Rene and Ayresy would know all about finals football, and they look like they're going to go very deep. The Brisbane Lions, with the list they've got, the depth they've got, and at this stage, they're my tip for the flag.
Yeah, just jumping in straight away. Look, I love Lachie Neale's game this year. He's been fantastic. I'm looking at him very closely for a Brownlow medal because he just keeps getting the ball, keeps doing something with it, and also puts something on the scoreboard. So, you know, when they've got those sort of players going great, Hipworth came out and did something special last week, 5 goals in his game. So, look, they're going very, very nicely. What do you think, Gary?
Yeah, no, I think you're right there, Rene. As far as watching the games that have been on in this footy frenzy, it's probably not so bad in my household. My partner doesn't like watching footy unless it's the mighty Borough down there at CF.
Yes.
So it's pretty good from our point of view, or my point of view anyway. And I think I'm a bit with yourself and obviously Xanas as well, that I think the games that have been really watchable, like a Richmond-Port Adelaide or a Brisbane game the other night, they're the ones that I think keep you attracted to obviously what's going on. But there's some very defensive games, and there's obviously no doubt some players that are super important to where their teams are going to be going, and fingers crossed that we don't keep seeing the amount of injuries. I see where Jay Gresham looks like he might be out now for the rest of the season as well. So I think it's going to be pretty important that these guys get through this amount of games. But I wouldn't certainly discount Geelong. I think they were pretty impressive the other night, taking St Kilda apart. And I know they've got certainly guys that have probably been there and done that, but they've got a good core group of young boys that I think are showing a little bit too. So it's just each week it depends on who plays well, and they're the favourites for the grand final. So I think this next 4 or 5 games are going to be pretty important in solidifying those teams in the top 8.
We might
Just
get
getting
back to those. We'll get back to looking at the actual makeup of the top 4 and have a look at some of those games maybe in a few moments' time. But there are some big stories bubbling around, and it's now a fait accompli. There is no way there's going to be a grand final in Victoria for the first time in the history of league football. It's going interstate, and, well, a lot of people have Brisbane as the front runners. I've got a reason why they should be not considered, but I'll keep my powder dry. Let's go to you first, Zanners. No grand final in Melbourne, that's a certainty. Where do you think it should be? Where do you think it will be?
Oh, look, I think Optus Stadium's the logical choice, obviously holding 60,000. But, look, I wouldn't mind actually seeing it in Brisbane. I think with the ground condition, I think to grow it up, up north, I think it'd be a fantastic, I suppose, fire starter to ignite where the rugby league has really taken off, obviously with the Broncos. It's a rugby league stronghold, but I'd like to see it played in Brisbane for the growth of the game. But I just think logistically, Optus Stadium in Perth, I think that's the place to play it.
How about you, Rene?
I'm along the same lines as Zanners in regards to where it should be. I'm pretty keen on Brisbane because all the hubs have been there basically and will continue to be there. So, yeah, look, I think Brisbane could certainly host it. Taking it to Perth, I think there's a lot of people going to miss out. But to getting to Brisbane's, I think it's where it should be.
And you, Gary?
Yeah, I think because it's such an unusual year, if you probably look back about a month or so ago, really, when everyone had to be relocated primarily to Queensland/Brisbane, I think they've done so much to keep the AFL season alive this year. I think we probably would certainly be pretty much stuffed if we didn't have the Queensland Premier being able to do what she's done. And I think it's probably a fairly easy decision to let Brisbane have it. And again, the amount of work that's been put into this season, I think they'd certainly be the front runners in my estimation anyway.
Okay, does the name David Sandusky mean anything to you, gentlemen?
No.
No, but it's a lousy Scrabble hand.
Yeah. David Sandusky is the man who replaced Kevin Mitchell as curator of the Gabba. He'd done some associate work. He'd done some work at the MCG, mainly at Allan Border Field. He's a Queenslander and he's a dickhead. He's the guy that at the start of last season denied Brisbane Lions the right to train on the Gabba because he was preparing a wicket for November the 6th, the Test match. Now, it was after a couple of Dell concerts, but it was in March. And he basically kicked the Brisbane Lions off. And what he was doing was he was dancing to the tune, and a very loud tune, of anti-AFL sentiment, which is very strong in that part of Australia. Now, there's a lot of people in Brisbane who are uncomfortable about the existence or the growth of AFL football, and he aligned himself with them and made things extreme in 2018, not last year, the year before. In 2018, made things extremely difficult for Brisbane, put them on another ground for their entire pre-season, roped off the centre square when they were allowed to train on the ground, and basically acted like a sort of an envoy of the NRL in an anti-AFL stance. Now, he's still the bloke in charge, and I don't reckon his ground deserves an AFL Grand Final.
Yeah, it's a pretty hard call, mate, but I'm sure the right powers will step in, particularly the AFL, and negotiate something quite clear and very cut to the point that this is what's happening, and Miss Premier, this is where we want it. We want the best of everything. So.
He'll be all smiles and kisses now, but don't ever forget where his heart really lies. He is.
Yeah, you don't like him.
Bootstraps.
You don't like him, Mark.
Yeah, I got that feeling too, Rene.
Well, do you remember
you called him a dickhead,
when
so...
Brisbane couldn't train at the Gabba? I mean, they were shut out from their home ground by the curator with the flimsiest excuse I've ever heard in my life. November 6th.
Well, I think that gives us more ammunition to actually have it at the Gabba, just to get him offside.
No, but he'll be up front. He'll be taking all the accolade. You know, he'll be there, all smiles. Doesn't the only thing the Brisbane curator do? Isn't all they do sit on the covers waiting for the rain to come? Wasn't that Kevin Dixon's special?
And doesn't it also come down to which actual bid is the highest? Because certainly you'd imagine the AFL are pretty keen to get some dollars back into the system. So does it now come who actually bids the most so that the AFL could then possibly make that decision?
Yeah, that must be part of it. Must be financial. But wouldn't it be fair if, I mean, of course, dependent on COVID movements, where you're allowed to play it, but shouldn't the team that finishes highest, if they're a non-Victorian team, or if it's WA, if it's a WA, South Australian, Queensland team, there's every chance it will be, because you've got West Coast Eagles, Port Adelaide, and Brisbane running for you. Well, if one of those finishes on top or higher than their opponent, shouldn't they host it?
Could you play it in Port? Could you play it in Adelaide, the grand final? I don't know. Could you?
Why not? If Port make it and they finish on top, haven't they earned the right to host it?
Of course they would. And so they should.
It's a pretty fair point. It's probably going to come down to the restrictions, though, doesn't it, Finey? Like, what are the quarantine restrictions in relation to that? It's the unknown at this stage, obviously, but it certainly gives you a fair bit of pull if you do finish on top, you would have thought.
Yeah, I'd love it if, because it's the WA Premier's been playing hardball. Queensland and South Australia have this corridor, so they can you can travel to South Australia and Queensland and vice versa. But WA's playing hardball. Wouldn't it be great if West Coast made the grand final against Port and couldn't go? Well, they could go, but they could never come back.
Might be a few people happy with that.
They are memorable, aren't they, guys? Grand finals that aren't played at the MCG. Take our minds back to 1991, obviously, at VFL Park. It was a surreal atmosphere.
Oh, it was, Xander's, but of course the thing is, you might want to think about the pre-game entertainment. It was Angry Anderson and the Batmobile, mate. So,
who played that year, 91?
The Mighty Hawks and the West Coast Eagles.
Good.
Speaking of, Paul Deere won the Norm Smith that year, Gary?
Yeah, he did, Xander's. Yep, great effort by the big pumpkin head. So it was it was an amazing effort. So yeah, one and only time.
He wasn't a bad ruckman, Gary, when he was on song.
He was, and he probably had to use more of his, I guess, ruck guile and nous, because he wasn't a big lad as far as height-wise, but he was certainly quite strong around the hips and all that sort of stuff. But he was a wonderful foil going forward when you had Brereton and Dunstall as well. And, of course, then they had guys who potentially could cover them to a degree. But, of course, then you had a third tall in Paul Deere, and they just couldn't handle him. And you throw in a Tony Hall, and then, of course, then you throw in a Paul Hudson, who I think might have kicked 60-odd goals that year. So it was a pretty impressive forward line all over. But, yeah, no, Paul was terrific that day.
He was one of those, and they're great in finals, aren't they? Swingmen like Lee Brown. I mean, Paul could play in the right, could play forward, could play back if you wanted. They are great in finals football because, especially with a good coach, they can sort of pick the guys out of the opposition and see where to take advantage of that particular strength. Now, just on grand finals, not at the MCG, you said Angry Anderson was the pre-game entertainment. Well, angry was the theme. So before 1991, when was the previous grand final not at the MCG? Well, so 91, not at the G. What year do we have to go back to for the next one not at the G?
Well, I'd say,
was it?
45.
Was it the Olympics? 56, the Olympics?
No, it was 45.
Really?
Carlton
The
versus
bloodbath.
South Melbourne. The bloodbath.
Yep. The bloodbath at Princes Park.
Wow.
Wow.
Carlton, South Melbourne. Very nasty game. There's a bit of footage of that game. If that footage is anything to go by, you wouldn't want to have been an umpire, boundary umpire, because he got belted. There were some pretty willing blokes going around in that game.
I think, was it Bob Chitty?
Oh, yeah, it would have been shitty by the end of the game.
Yeah, he went chitty, bang, bang. Thank you very much.
Yeah, well, he played Ned Kelly in a movie, so no surprise that he could handle himself. And the year before that was Fitzroy's last premiership, 44 at the Junction Oval. So, yeah, during the war there were some interesting ones. Let's get back to the present. Now, Dennis Pagan has come out and he has stated, well, Zanners, you're all over this, but give us his stance on his beloved North Melbourne and then let's go around the room and get some opinions of the men who know, Rene and Gary.
Yeah, well, Dennis Pagan, obviously, he's come out and, one of the great coaches, coached the Kangaroos to 2 flags, and he believes it's time for North to bottom out. He just doesn't see a rebuild, a mid-rebuild, mid-season. He probably haven't got the cattle at the Kangas at the moment. And he says, for the first time in a long, long time, North Melbourne need to bottom out. And I'm really interested to hear Rene and Gary as a coach to get their thoughts on what is the difference between bottoming out and a rebuild.
Go for it, Gary.
Yeah, I always find these conversations very interesting personally because unless you're involved behind the scenes 24/7, you're obviously just having an opinion from afar. And I guess someone like Dennis Pagan would certainly know with the history of where he has been at North Melbourne, and I don't know how he's used, whether there's some sort of ability to bounce things off him, being a great coach, a premiership coach and all that sort of thing. But a rebuild, I guess if I think back to if I was associated with things like that, there was a time in 1978 when Hawthorn won their last flag and then they didn't make the finals in 79, 80 and 81. So they were rebuilding because there was quite a few guys that were, I guess, playing in the under-19s and then certainly reserves and then, on the fringe of being involved in the senior team. And then when Alan Jeans came to the football club, he obviously then brought those younger guys together, such as a Dermot Brereton, Peter Schwab, John Kennedy Jr., Chris Mew, myself, Chris Langford. A couple of years later, Andy Collins came. So to me, that's the sort of rebuild. You still had the nucleus of great players in Michael Tuck, Calvin Moore, Lee Matthews. But when you're talking about obviously bottoming out, it's a bit probably what obviously the Suns have had to do. We're currently looking at, obviously, Melbourne had to sort of go back a little bit. Obviously what I guess Richmond did there for a little while before they sort of got themselves organised. So you just got to rely on the draft picks. And if you can do that well, as Port Adelaide showing, then you can actually come back up the ladder pretty bloody quickly. It's about obviously nurturing and educating that youth that's coming through. So bottoming out, certainly go back down to the bottom. And then the only way you'd like to think is going up. But it's not a quick fix solution. It's something that's going to take a bit of time. What does Rene think?
Look, Gary, I fully concur with you on this. What I see of North Melbourne, I like what I see. And I think Reece, starting from last year and what we saw towards the end of the year and what he was able to do was terrific. And I believe they've got some good young players, but they certainly are quite a way off the mark. So therefore, as you said, Gary, they need they certainly need to rebuild and introduce players and keep introducing through the draft, as you said, Gary. But there's potential there. I like what they're doing, and I think Reece is the guy for the job. So wait and see.
Yeah, they probably haven't done as well when they've actually got players from other clubs, whereas Hawthorn's done exceptionally well with Burgoyne and O'Meara and Mitchell. There's probably been very little of that, I think, Rene, that North Melbourne just haven't got as much bang for their buck in those players that have come across from other clubs, such as an Aaron Hall or, Jed Anderson's a good kid, tries really hard, but again, they're not in the same class as those other players.
Yeah, I fully agree. And look, I see so much at different times in their game and the young kids, but when it comes down to the real crunch, they're not up to the speed of the better, stronger players and clubs. So, yeah, there's a bit to look forward to, though. And I think Reece Shaw's on the right path. So we'll wait and see.
I'll tell you what, it would have been pretty disheartening being a North fan over the last 3 or 4 years during the trade period, because they have put their head in the ring for some of the biggest names on the trade table, and they keep on getting no, thank you, Josh Kelly, Dylan Shield. They would have loved to have Tom Lynch come to the club. Basically, any big name, they've got the money to pay for them, but they have not been able to convince them to come to North Melbourne. And the problem has been that it seems as though they've spent sort of most of trade period focusing on the one or two big names and ended up scrambling for a Pittard or a Hall or a Marley Williams at the end of proceedings, which hasn't really made the difference. Magjack Dawes a really good player. I think you can build something around him. Larky looks good. He looks really good to me. You've got to pick the guys you can build a team around. Tarrant's still got plenty of good football left in him, so as frustrating as it is, they've got to realise they haven't had Cunnington or Zeeble this year. Ben Brown maybe has a bit of currency. I'd move him on if the deal was good. I reckon Essendon could be, especially if they lost Danaher, could stump up something pretty good for him, a first-round pick. The problem is that this year you're taking a bit of a risk with your first-round pick because there hasn't been a TAC Cup or any other meaningful competition. Certainly, the Sandfall's going and I think the Waffle's going, but it's pretty difficult. So it is problematic, isn't it? And
very much so. Yeah.
Aren't the Bulldogs getting the number one player this year?
Not sure about that, but I see where
the boy Ugle.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah, out of the Oakley Chargers.
That might be an academy pick. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. The Footscray Academy, don't you, Zanners? That great college of where is the Footscray Academy?
Come on, fine. Is he and Kinky? He having a crack as usual.
Footscray Academy sounds like somewhere you get belted up on a Saturday night if you give somebody lip at the local.
I'll tell you what, Finey, that academy's been pretty fruitful over the years, the Bravebrook boys. You've had DJ, you've had Ryan Wilson, and you've had the great Dougie Hawkins. Not three pretty good players.
Yeah,
Troy, as I see the game, and we're just talking about North Melbourne, you've got to ask yourself the question, why are Port Melbourne so successful at the moment? And it's possibly because Dixon is putting himself in a situation of being one-on-one or close enough to, being able to also mark the ball and hold the ball, so therefore he's a chance to kick goals. He's missed a couple of easy ones, as we know, recently. But I think they've also got the other players around him to be able to convert goals, and that's the name of the game, kick the ball through the big sticks. And we look at North Melbourne with Brown. He's not getting near the ball. So there's not much happening down on the forward line. So that's one of North Melbourne's big problems, as it is with other clubs. Richmond, of course, have got the two key players up there, and when they're on song, Richmond kick goals. So you've got to ask yourself about the game as it sits, and clubs that have got the ability to do that and have those players at the foot of where it should be, where the traffic is, and to be able to get the ball out of the traffic and kick goals. And they're the teams, as I see, going forward. There's probably only 4 or 5 max, like I called last week, that are able to do that and will do that. And West Coast very much so, because they can get the ball out of the middle, they can get it down to their 2 key forwards, and then there's plenty of options after that on the ground. And that's what they're all about, as they have ran over Carlton, as we saw. So
But
that's how I see it at the moment.
As you well know, Rene and Ayres and Finey, that the delivery from the middle is absolutely paramount. And
It's
at
crucial
Port Adelaide
at the moment,
and
absolutely
the West Coast
crucial.
Eagles, they've got highly skilled midfielders, half-forward flankers, and as you said, Rene, those pockets are right where they need to be, around the honeypot that is Charlie Dixon and Josh Kennedy with the West Coast.
Yeah. I just love the West Coast. Once they're on song and they're going, their midfield absolutely takes everyone apart. And they get it up there and it just makes it easier for the two key forwards because the ball comes out so quickly. There's still 6 players up there. And, it's up to them to win the ball. If they don't win it, it goes to ground. There's plenty on the honeypot, as you said, Troy.
Rene, West Coast midfield is military medium at best. They are just an average midfield, but they get silver service from the best cat ruckman in the competition.
Oh, well, that's part of the midfield. What a great job he's doing.
That just, you put the ball down the throat of an on-baller with 6'6", and when I say they're just, they just go that midfield, honestly. Shuey Sheed, Gaff is a bit of an, outside runner, but with that armchair service, boy, oh boy, is he good in that and Louis.
Oh, well, that's what I looked at when West Coast beat Collingwood in the preliminary final. He was such an important part of the game for them to be, in the grand final.
And I think the systems, I was going to say, and I think the systems that obviously the really good teams have in relation to their ruck prowess, was it last week when Nick Nat went forward and, of course, took the ruck work and actually tapped it down Josh Kennedy's throat, and they end up scoring a goal from a stoppage. So it's a little bit unusual that we probably, from a Melbourne perspective, don't see Max Gawn doing as much rucking forward as Nick Nat does or Grundy does or those other really top-flight ruckmen. So any way that you can score, it'd have to be worth their weight in gold, and obviously utilising the attributes that someone like Nick Nat's got, because you've already worked so hard to get the ball inside your forward line and deep. So then having the creativity and the leap and, of course, the expertise of Nick Nat, those midfielders from West Coast, they would absolutely be loving it. And I think that's where St Kilda's improved a little bit too, Finey. This too with Paddy Ryder doing the centre bounces, and with the 6, 6 and 6, you can get absolute unbelievable delivery to a 1v1, and that makes a big difference in the modern game.
He's a beautiful ruckman, Ryder. I'll say this, how about the forgotten footballer at West Coast? I mean, you're right, Rene, that forward line, it's got danger written all over it. And I don't mean Paddy, I mean Kennedy, Darling, another ruckman. You got Cripps down there, you got Ryan, but imagine if Rioli hadn't, come a cropper, because he was just he's the pea, isn't he? The cream, that really little forward with brilliant speed and agility. That forward line with Rioli is almost perfect. But, of course, he has to look from the sidelines. Just on sort of observations, Hawthorn. Now, is it time for Clarko to maybe this rebuild business? I mean, it's, rebuild. Port Adelaide, they wanted to do a rebuild. They invested in some early draft picks, and you know what happened? They were brilliant because they got Rosie, Butters, Dersma and Georgiadis. Brilliant work. Doesn't always work like that. What should Hawthorn do, Izzy?
Yeah, it's going to obviously be thrown around, Finey, about where Clarko's at with his list at the minute. But by God, he's won 4 premierships as a coach since 2008. The boys had the 3-peat. As I mentioned before, he's had unbelievable success through selective recruiting, whether that's been Burgoyne, O'Meara, Frawley. He even brought in Brian Lake as well, and McAvoy, as you mentioned. And he based those around some wonderful draft picks in, gee whiz, imagine picking up Buddy Franklin, imagine picking up Jared Ruffhead as well. And, of course, you talked about Rioli before, but Cyril Rioli was magic, obviously, playing at Hawthorn. So, and And as a coach, and I'm sure Rene would know this too, and even Xanas for that matter, that a coach actually develops such a love and respect for his players when they've given you so much and they're your most valuable asset. It's actually pretty hard then to say, hey, you're out the door without showing a bit of faith. And that's what Clarko's shown for a long period of time. He hasn't been frightened, by the way, when Jordan Lewis and obviously Sammy Mitchell were, said, okay, this might be time for you guys. But he still had them having, I guess, the best ability to go and play somewhere else. It hasn't made them any less in the eyes of obviously all the Hawthorn people and probably the football world in general. So I think, again, Alistair Clarkson knows exactly what he's doing. He's starting to blood some kids. What you've got to be very careful of, though, Finey, is that you don't want to put in too many kids. You still need that nucleus or that small group of experienced players. And, again, we're all looking at it from afar. How bloody hard would it be playing in these hubs and playing every 4 days and, staying motivated, not seeing your family? So maybe this year is just not going to be Hawthorn's year, but they've proven over a long period of time they're never too far away.
I mean, that's a really good point. I want to throw it to you, Rene. Young players, the fans, if your team's not going to make the 8, everybody wants the kids. But there is a number, isn't there? You get to a point where you put too many on the field at one time and they're not going to learn or develop. And it might have held Carlton back over the last few years. You've been at clubs that have been successful and unsuccessful, Rene. You can't just turf out the old blokes and say, give the kids the keys to the castle, can you? Not all of them.
No, look, I agree with you, Finey, but then I throw to Gary, and he's a gentleman who's been coaching and been in football for so long, and very successful coach at Port Melbourne. But he's also coached AFL. So where's the difference from he's not continuing to be in AFL coaching to being where he is currently now at Port Melbourne, and who's had the influence on you, Gary, in terms of how you see young boys going through and being a part of your club and your coaching? Did Alistair Clark have a lot of influence on you as to where you're currently sitting?
No, not necessarily. It was probably more who had the biggest influence on me would have been Alan Jeans, because I think we all realise in life, and obviously we're talking about our footballing life, some coaches just happen to be at the right place at the right time, and Alan Jeans was one for me, and he actually spoke to me in a manner that made me feel very confident and understand what I needed to do. And that could be a coach, it could be a manager, it could be a CEO, it could be someone in charge of a business. And when you look at what those coaches have done, and having been, I guess, able to stay in the industry a long time, my main bag of philosophies would be very much around what Alan Jeans did, but there was a little bit of Alan Joyce. State games, Rene, you've played under guys like Kevin Sheedy and had an opportunity to work with the great Malcolm Blight, so you've got a little bit of what they did as well. And, of course, I had 2 years with Kevin Sheedy at Essendon, and it gave me a lot more confidence to go back into coaching at Port Melbourne, because some of the things I did at Geelong and Adelaide worked, whereas if I'd have tweaked them a little bit how Sheeds maybe have done it, then there might have been a little bit more longevity from a coaching point of view. So I was only 34 when I went to Geelong. That's pretty young to start coaching.